Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. And it's lovely to see you for another of our online family talks that Care Visions is organising. And as usual, we've got our very interesting guest to talk to us. We're going to be talking about how we navigate misogyny and the manosphere, and we'll talk more about that as we go through this session. I'm Linda DeCasticker. I'm a public health doctor. I'm part of the Care Visions and Why Not Trust team. Anyway, today we're very fortunate that we've got Professor Harriet Over. She's a psychologist by background and a professor at York University. And Harriet, I'm going to ask you just to introduce yourself and say a bit about who you are.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So I'm Harriet. I'm a professor of developmental and social psychology at the University of York. For the last 15 years or so, I've been studying prejudice and discrimination in children and how children learn social biases. And more recently, I've started investigating the manosphere and how it's affecting the behaviour and experiences of young people, and also what we can do as parents and as educators to help protect our children from toxic spaces online.
And manosphere, what do you mean by that word?
This is a combination of blogs and forums and influencers that's emerged over the last 15 years or so that amplify cultural messages that women are inferior to men and ought to be subordinated to them. So we can think of different communities within the manosphere. So I'm sure everyone here has heard of incels or involuntary celibates. So these are young men typically who can't find girlfriends um, and blame women for being uninterested into them. There have been some very high profile murders that seem to have been motivated by membership in this incel community. There's also MGTOW, or men going their own way. So these are a community of men who believe that women are so manipulative and destructive force in society that it's better to live a single life as far away from women as possible. And we can also think of proponents of the red and black pill. So these are people who believe that society is systematically biased in favor of women, and that most people fail to see that. And what you need to do is take one of these red or black pills in order to see the supposed truth about society.
Lee's already come in, red or black pill like in the Matrix.
That's right, exactly. So it's this reference to popular culture and the Matrix film franchise. So in the Matrix, Neo is offered a choice between taking the blue pill and allowing him to return to the Matrix and live an apparently idyllic life, or taking a red pill and seeing society for what it truly is. And so that this idea of a red and black pill within the manosphere is drawn from that part of the Matrix films.
And I read in one of your papers that young men are engaging with the manosphere at an increasing rate. Can you tell us about that, and how do you know that?
This is a very difficult question to get a handle on, for two reasons. So, one reason is that when we ask young men how much of his content you're engaging with, they might be reluctant to tell us because there are kind of strong social norms around gender equality, and also these online spaces teach them to be mistrustful of academics and researchers, and educators who are interested in this topic. The second reason why it's difficult to estimate is an ethical one. So imagine that I wanted to ask young people, have you engaged with this particular influencer? I run the risk of letting them know about an influencer that they hadn't heard of and inadvertently like sending them down a pathway that they might not otherwise have taken. Um, but we do have some really useful data on this topic. A lot of it comes from polling. Um, so there was a poll by Hope Not Hate in 2023 which suggested that 80% of 16 and 17-year-old British boys have watched Andrew Tate content. So Andrew Tate's a notorious misogynistic influencer, whereas only 60% of boys in the same demographic could name who the prime minister was. Now, of course, watching this content or watching some of this content is not the same as engaging with it in a deep way. So polls suggest that about 20% of young men are regularly engaging with this content and approve of the views of people like Andrew Tate.
Yeah. So some will just be, "Oh, I've heard about this." They might go on it and think, no, that's not for me. So that
Yeah.
makes for the high 80%. But even 20% is is high. And
Yeah, when you think about how extreme some of the messages in this space is, 20% is something that we need to be very concerned.
yeah. And can you say more about what is the impact of listening to this or um, um, hearing these messages? What's the impact on both the young men themselves, but also on the women or the young women that they may be around?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I'm really interested in. And over the next 5 years, we have a new grant to study online misogyny. And it's one of the questions that we're going to be asking. Now, I know that you're a doctor by training, and so you'll know that in these types of areas, we can't run experimental studies where we
Mm.
expose one group of children to this type of content and another to Gardener's World or to music videos or whatever, because we anticipate that it's going to be harmful. So we have to try and piece together causal evidence from various other sources. So, for example, recently we conducted a survey with 200 teachers, 100 who were secondary school teachers and 100 who were primary school teachers. And 76% of the secondary school teachers said they were extremely concerned about the ways in which online misogyny was affecting the behavior and experiences of their pupils. And quite strikingly, I think 60% of primary school teachers said that they were also extremely concerned. And when we asked them, well, how do you think online misogyny is affecting your pupils? They gave these really vivid examples. So, one primary school teacher, for example, reported a conversation she'd had with a little boy who'd said it's okay to hurt women because Andrew Tate does it. Um, and so we see these themes emerging from those data where boys are engaging in discriminatory behavior against female pupils, but also against female teachers. So teachers report that boys are saying things like, I don't have to listen to you because you're a woman. You should be in the kitchen and not teaching me, trying to physically intimidate them when they try and give them a consequence for bad behavior. Um, and we also see in those qualitative data themes around not understanding what consent is or thinking that it's acceptable to control or abuse your girlfriends. Um, we've also found when we do correlational studies that the extent to which young men engage with online misogyny predicts the extent to which they endorse coercive and controlling behaviors within intimate partner relationships. I think we need to think very seriously about, like you say, I'm really glad you mention how it's affecting young men as well as um, women and girls. And that's something that we're very interested in too. So I think there are a number of different elements to that. So one is that this is a really deeply homophobic space as well as a sexist, misogynistic place. And and so we have to think about how is this affecting members of the LGBT plus community. Another element of this is that there's very toxic messaging around mental health in the manosphere. So Andrew Tate, for example, is notorious for saying that depression isn't real. And that's the tip of the iceberg with this type of content. So there are lots of misogynistic influencers who are saying things like real men can't be depressed, um, or like implying that depression's the opposite of success. And one of the things we're very interested in is whether listening to this type of content and the kind of toxic masculine norms within it might discourage men from seeking help for their mental
Mm.
health problems. Then a third element of it is this phenomenon of looks maxing, which I mean, some of you in the audience might have come across. So that is where boys are encouraged to modify their physical appearance to be more attractive or to look more like alpha males. Some of these processes are relatively innocuous, so things like growing a beard or going to the gym, but some of them are potentially quite dangerous. So there's this phenomenon of bone smashing that's been popular on social media platforms where boys are encouraged to repeatedly hit their face with a hammer. And the idea is that it'll permanently change their bone structure in a way that would make them look more masculine. Now, we don't have good data on how many young men are actually doing that. We know that it's talked a lot on social media and that um, videos advocating for that type of practice are watched a lot.
And you talked at the start about um, young men who maybe they're not finding women or flocking to them, or they're being rejected when they ask people out on dates or whatever. Does this kind of messaging, is that partly because they feel their self-esteem is low because they feel they've not got a girlfriend or
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look back to when we were adolescents or when your kids were adolescents, it's a horrible time for everyone, isn't it? It is like fraught with rejection and embarrassment and disappointment. And these influencers are preying on teenage boys at just the bad time when people start dating. And what they're doing is providing a lens through which to understand those difficult experiences of rejection and so on, and blaming them on women. Whereas the truth is, of course, that like girls are struggling at that age too, and
Mm.
everybody struggles with dating. It sucks, doesn't it? So I think part of the solution to these types of problems is trying to reframe those problems, not as the fault of women, but as an inevitable part of what it is to be a teenager.
And obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the program Adolescence, and
Yeah.
somebody's asked that in the chat. And that's raised the profile of some of this. Has that been a good thing as far as from your view? Has it made more people talk about this?
I think the more people who talk about this, the better. And it's certainly, there's been a research interest in this topic for the last 10 years or so, and really fantastic investigative journalism on this topic. But I think this TV show, Adolescence, has really opened a lot of people's eyes to the nature of a problem. Because I think unless you work with young people, you might not see the
Mm.
scale of this online space, because these influencers, they don't engage with mainstream or what they call legacy media, but teenagers are seeing it all the time. So I think that this adolescence has opened up a possibility for a discussion and a moment for social change. I guess there are also elements of it that I think are a little bit risky. So the government suggested showing this in schools.
Yeah.
And I think that there are some downsides that we need to consider to that. I'm very worried about the possibility that if boys feel demonized, they'll be less likely to engage in constructive ways in discussions around gender and sexism.
And given this is about male views of women, i- do some fathers support their young men in this kind of view?
Yeah, so there was a the same poll that I mentioned before by Internet Matters in 2023. It suggested that 56% of fathers under the age of 35 approve of Andrew Tate. Older fathers, somewhat less so. Um, but that, of course, creates an enormous problem, because it means that the types of views that children are hearing online might be reinforced by what they're hearing at home.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what question again in the chat? Why is Andrew Tate's content so much wider spread than other male influencers? He's the one that we all know and talk about, but there are other, well, in this sphere, but there are also a lot of male influencers, presumably, who are very positive and would, support equality. And why are they not having that same impact?
Well, yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think part of the answer comes down to how social media recommender algorithms work.
Yeah.
But these recommender algorithms, they're designed to keep users on the site. And the more people engage with particular content, the the more it's going to be recommended to young people. And Andrew Tate's such a controversial figure. He says these extreme things, and then some people are engaging with that content because they like it. Some people are engaging with that content because they hate it. But either way, his profile is getting higher and higher, and social media algorithms are going to recommend his content because it's getting so much attention.
Yeah. And in terms of ethnicity, are we seeing this mainly in white males?
There's very little data on that topic. It so I don't know. I don't know. The field does not
Yeah.
have a good answer to that question. I would say that anybody can be drawn into this type of world. Um, Andrew Tate himself is not white, he's biracial, and there's certainly among misogynistic influencers, it's quite ethnically diverse on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also has these connections to white supremacy. So various of these influencers who are deeply misogynistic will also say extremely racist and extremely anti-Semitic things. And in fact, it's very difficult to draw a clear line between the alt-right and white supremacy and the manosphere. So I think that the relationship between ethnicity and misogyny is very complicated, and something that as a field we don't have a good handle on yet.
Yeah. And have you seen any schools or good examples in schools of the teachers trying to counteract these messages, and how it can't be easy, but how have they attempted to do that?
We have been doing research with teachers, and I've been overwhelmed by how supported they've been. They've really devoted so much time to talking to us and telling us about what's happening in their schools now and what they want to be happening. We've been working with the PSAG Association, which is an organisation of teachers in England and Wales who are responsible for teaching personal, social, and health education. And we've been developing these resources for teachers to help them have conversations with young people who they work with about the manosphere. So part of that is outlining what it is, what type of language to look out for, and then to talk them through the value of, where possible, discussing, opening up conversations with children and encouraging them to think, well, what do you think the influencer's motivation is in this case? How do you think the social media recommender algorithms work? Can you think of a counter examples to these types of cases? So encouraging children to think critically about what they engage with online. And that advice is all freely available online. I can send you afterwards, if you like, I can send you a link to the guide
That
if anybody's
that would be
interested in
great. That would
seeing.
be really helpful. It'd be good to move on and think, so how do we counteract and address this? And there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll come back to. But in families, as parents, how do you address this with both your young daughters as well as your young sons?
This is something I think about a lot. So I'm a mum and I have two children but they're 7 and 3. So I mean, take what I say with a pinch of salt, because I haven't yet had to deal with my girls being exposed to very deeply misogynistic content. But I do talk to them about equality from very, very young. And I already talk to them about sexism and about racism and about homophobia, because I think the most important thing is that the first time they hear something sexist, I want it to be in a safe environment when I can talk through them why that's wrong and why it's harmful, and not from an influencer online. So I want them to grow up understanding the ways in which they're privileged and also the ways in which they might be discriminated against as girls. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I know some parents are reluctant to talk to their children about these sorts of things because they want to keep them safe from
Mm.
like all the horrible things that are in the world. And I do understand that feeling. But for me, I think preparing children for the world they're going to go into is really crucial. So as a parent, I try to have those conversations with my children.
And what would you say to the parents of boys to, as they're coming into adolescence, how would you have a conversation with them?
I think this is something that we need to think about all the way through parenting, isn't it? So when you have children in primary school age, you want to be talking to them about positive female role models and also positive male role models. So
Yes.
what we've I think it's so crucial to slowly build up a commitment to equality through talking to children about what men can be like and all the different ways to be a man, all the different ways to be a woman. The manosphere says men can't be supportive and caring. They're in a constant competition with each other. But there are so many wonderful role models out there of men who are competitive, but also supportive and kind, men who do their best for their community. So I think it's a case of highlighting all of those wonderful role models and also talking to them about how, yeah, there are some ways in which society disadvantages men, but there are also lots of ways in which it disadvantages women. Um, and to encourage them to think critically about what they see online.
Yeah.
Take these things with a pinch of salt, because these influencers, they claim that they're speaking on behalf of men, but actually a lot of it's exploiting teenage boys and young men as well as harming women.
And we've had a number of conversations in these sessions before about communicating with your teenager, in particular, one, how to get your teenager out the bedroom, and um, just that importance of communication, so that your your teenager will tell you, I'm hearing these things, and I think there might be some truth in it, and you can at least have that conversation.
I'm sure many
Um,
people in this chat know better than me, because I haven't yet tried to parent a teenager, but that's absolutely crucial, isn't it? That if, when you hear your child say something sexist, you rely on your hot reaction and just shut it down, then the chance that they're willing to come back to you and tell you what they're seeing online is lower. So I think where possible, we need to be trying to open up conversations with young people rather than just shutting it down. Obviously, there are some cases where you have to shut things down because somebody's in danger or it's just so toxic that you have to teach them not to say something.
There's a really good question in the chat about young men who are becoming fathers. Is
Mm,
there work that could be done to influence them at that stage? So there's conversations with expectant parents.
yeah.
Now, I've at various points in my career run or tried to organise parenting classes for expectant parents, and it was quite difficult to get a good take up with mothers and fathers. But I don't know if there's any work that suggests these are conversations that could happen at that time.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea to me. And I think it's also about systemic social change, isn't it? Like I saw in Scotland there was a march for fathers to have better paternity leave recently. And I
Yeah.
think that's part of a solution too, isn't it? Like making sure that men have the opportunity to be engaged fathers who spend time with their infants and who share child rearing duties. That's also a part of the solution in addition to conversations that we can have around how to be a dad.
Yeah. And we talked before about are there ethnic differences in views around this, and obviously there'll be cultural differences depending on somebody's background or even religion. And there's a comment in the chat about somebody who supports asylum seekers and asylum seeking young people, and worries that some of the information that's being fed online reflects some of their cultural experiences and what
Yeah.
society is like from where they've come from. Is there a way of addressing that?
This is something that, as a researcher, I think about a lot because there are these two values that we hold dear. So, one is that we want to encourage more egalitarian behavior among children and young people, and the other is that we want to respect cultural differences. And I think ideally we want to develop interventions that can be tailored to different communities to be maximally persuasive and respectful of people's diversity. Um, but I think, we can all get together on some of the content of a manosphere being really deeply problematic. For example, there are forums that are dedicated to the idea that rape should be legalized because women shouldn't deserve a choice in who they date or have sex with. So this is really, really extreme content that I don't think we can put down to cultural differences. This is something that, no nobody should be endorsing. And yet there are these forums with thousands of engagements advocating for that sort of idea.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that within these forums, as well as misogyny, there's also racism and homophobia is all part
Yeah.
of the same attitude.
Yeah, that's right. So there are these very close connections between the manosphere and the far right. Like it's a very deeply homophobic space. There's quite frequent racism and there's some evidence that the manosphere is actually a pipeline to the far right and white supremacy. So,
Yeah.
so people might find white supremacy through engagement with these misogynistic spaces.
And we were talking about intervention. So how could you counteract this in families? But we've said a wee bit about schools, and we need to think about us as a broader society. How do we counteract that? And I know in your papers you talk about you need multi-level interventions. What do you mean by that? And can you say what that might look like?
Yeah, I think the Online Safety Act offers us this opportunity to protect women and girls and other marginalized communities in a much more substantial way online. So Why why is this stuff available online? Why can I log on to my computer and immediately see content suggesting that women should be denied the vote or that women are so inferior they shouldn't be allowed out of the house, they should be controlled by men? Um, there's evidence to suggest that when a teenage boy goes onto YouTube, within 20 minutes of being online, they're already being recommended content that's negative about women and girls without having searched for it. And that seems like a situation as a society that we need to change because really parents caregivers, educators, all we can do is fight a fire, right? But it's not a problem of our creation. Teachers and parents, they're on the front line of this problem that they didn't create. And I think there needs to be much stricter regulation of really what's available online and what's pushed to children.
Yeah. I mean, we do have legislation to stop some of these comments, and yet it's still going on in such an extreme way. But I don't know how what is the potential for addressing that. But as a society, we need to be fighting for that, don't we?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Online Safety Act has this real potential, but it's unclear how it's going to be operationalized still. So I think we need to be advocating as much as possible for the idea that this content is harmful and that it's inappropriate that it's pushed to children. Um,
Yeah.
and generating evidence about the types of harms that it's exacerbating.
And in your work with schools, are y- are there explicit um, lessons and discussions about equality and and counteracting these messages and trying to say, trying to give the opposite view? Do teachers feel empowered and skilled to do that?
Well, in our data, 90% of secondary school teachers say that they feel they would benefit from dedicated teaching materials that help them
Yeah.
address this topic. So there
Yeah.
is lots of excellent work in schools that's addressing related topics. So consent and healthy relationships and digital literacy and how to think critically about what's online and stereotyping and what the problems are with it. Um, but my PhD student and Ellen and I are trying to complement all of those important things with by developing a lesson that's specifically targeted on online misogyny and how to counter the myths within online misogyny. I think schools are currently quite variable in whether they address it directly or not. And what we want to do is create a lesson where, if schools want to, they can have this class um, that directly addresses this issue. But it's a long road to developing an intervention like that. So we've created these teaching materials. We're talking to teachers and to young people about them, and then that we're going to uh, test the intervention through a randomized control trial. And then eventually, hopefully, we'll have something that we can share.
Yeah, that would be good. Are some schools resistant to, you know, not want to think about these things or not really believe they're harmful?
We haven't encountered a lot of that yet. So that obviously our teachers are a self-selecting group, so
Yeah.
they volunteer to take part in our studies. And for the most part, teachers report that they're very concerned and that they're keen to help develop interventions. There are some schools that say that they don't experience particular problems, um, but they're in the minority.
Yeah. Are there any well, just before we move on to what I was about to say, there's a question saying, can you give us examples of how you bust some of these myths? What some of the things you would say quite explicitly on how you would say, no, that is not the case.
Yeah, of course. So, um, take, for example, the claim that women aren't as smart as men. There are a number of ways we could think about generating counterexamples to that claim. So, one is to talk about amazing women through history who have done fantastic things. So, they could be women from contemporary society or historical examples like Marie Curie, whatever. We could also think of that in terms of IQ. So, scientists measure intelligence through something called IQ tests. Men and women do not perform differently on IQ tests. If I took a group of women, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference from their IQs to a group of men. Also, if you look at the brains of men and women, they are indistinguishable from brain scans, whether you're looking at a brain of a woman or a brain of a man. You could also ask children to think about examples from their own lives. Do they know about smart women? Can they think of smart women who have done amazing things? And I think that sometimes helps, because some of the examples that I might think of, people who I think are amazing, teenagers today have barely heard of. Like, I think
Yeah.
Michelle Obama's amazing, but she probably seems like ancient history to teenagers today. So I think encouraging them to engage in the conversation and think of examples for themselves um, can be a really helpful part of these conversations.
And in terms of discussing relationships, do you have examples or advice on how you would discuss these relationships so that both boys don't feel that the messages they're seeing in the manosphere are correct, but women or young girls know what's acceptable and that they don't need to feel pressurized into anything?
Yeah, that's right. This is just such a complex question, isn't it? So part of it is about saying to boys, you know what? You're not alone. So there's lots of research in psychology that suggests that the most effective way to reduce prejudice is to create a superordinate identity where you say, look, you know what? Boys and girls, you're all in this together. Being a teenager is difficult. Actually, girls experience a lot of rejection in dating too. Um, and, you're experiencing that. Girls are experiencing those things as well. But then part of it is also talking to girls about what they can expect from relationships. So one of the things that teachers said to us in our studies is that girls are abused and they don't even realize that it's abuse because it's so normalized in our society.
Yeah,
So I think part of it is about talking to girls about how to safely stand up for themselves. So there's a community within the manosphere known as pickup artists, and they're basically teaching boys manipulative tricks to seduce women. And one of the major themes of this pickup artist community is how to overcome last minute resistance to sex. So the idea is that you can take a girl home, and then at the last minute she'll not want to engage in intercourse, and the idea is that it's how to overcome that last minute resistance. That's how they refer to it. But of course, what it really is rape. Um, and I guess part of that is talking to young boys about what that actually is. Like
yeah,
the influencers use all these euphemisms, but that's rape and it's a crime. And also talking to girls, I guess, about what they might encounter in those situations. And
yeah,
it's very, very difficult, isn't it? And very delicate.
yeah.
Um,
It is. And there's also a lot of pressure on girls. I know we did a survey of young people in Glasgow, and a lot of young women were saying they had sex because they felt it was expected, not because they particularly wanted to.
yeah.
And that's a form of that pressure, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It really is, and I guess part of it is about sharing norms about what percentage of girls do want that, so they know that they're not alone. I think another really important element that's not so often talked about in conversations around consent is image abuse. So there's been a couple of fantastic books published recently, one by Jess Davis that I've been reading, um, about, in intimate image abuse, and another by Laura Bates, who's written The New Age of Sexism, about um, so it sort of broadly aligned with the manosphere, there are these sites where men can take non-consensual images of women or share images of girlfriends without their consent with whole communities of men. Um, and and I guess like girls are terrified
Yeah,
of their images being shared. And you can also create these deep fake images where you can take someone's picture from social
yeah,
media and make it look like they're part of a porn scene. And in fact, one of the teachers in our study talked about how that had happened to a girl in their primary school, that a group of boys had taken their image and then inserted it into a porn app and then showed it to her and told her this is what you should be like. Um, and I think conversations around consent also need to talk about like what is it okay to do with images and what does it not okay to do with them? Because I
yeah,
think, a certain percentage of teenage boys don't even understand that that's abuse. And that's really crucial to talk about, like, why you can't do those things.
yeah.
And I mean, I guess there are also tips to give to girls in terms of
Uh-huh.
one of the things Jess Davis does in this book is to give tips to girls about how to keep themselves safe. And that's in no way is that victim blaming, but rather it's about how to minimize the chances that bad things happen, I guess.
Yeah. I know. It's easy for me to think, well, just don't let anyone take your photo. But
Mhm.
but maybe they don't always know it's happening, or
Yeah,
it's not as straightforward as that.
I think there are at least two ways in which, so quite often girls share these stories of images being taken without their consent, so secret recording or be recording while they're asleep. But also these deep fakes, you can look they can
Yeah,
somebody could make you look like you were in this image or even in this video
yeah,
without your knowledge at all. Um, but really people should be able to share images safely, right? Like, it's not girls' fault for sharing the images, but it is a risky thing to do.
and it brings me to a good point, is in these kind of circumstances, and we talked about this with sextortion previously, is there a risk that the girls feel, well, it was my fault? It's like
Yeah.
rape,
But I think
well, what did I do to encourage that? And that's often an attitude that's perpetuated. And we
yeah.
need to counteract that too, that you're the victim.
Yeah, that's right, that's absolutely right. There's so much victim blaming in our society, isn't there? Um, yeah, that's absolutely right. When I was younger, I had a stalker, and I was forced to take him to court. And I remember his lawyer saying to me, like, "Oh, this is because he flirted with him," and like, "Why did you lead him on?" and so on. And that's the tip of the iceberg of victim blaming,
Yeah,
like the level of abuse that women get and the level of the blame they get when they report being assaulted or being harassed is just a massive problem. And that's something that's perpetuated by the manosphere too. You know, one of the
yeah.
things that Andrew Tate's notorious for saying is that women must bear some responsibility for being raped. So again, it's amplifying this really problematic cultural message.
And I'm sitting here learning about this from you. And, my heart's beating faster than normal, and I'm feeling shocked and angry. And you're researching this day in, day out. How do you deal with that? Because it must be distressing, but also, does your view of men change? Are you finding it difficult to deal with that?
I don't think my view of men has changed. I guess it's important to remember that. So we talked in the start of a podcast about how 20% of people engage very deep 20% of young men engage deeply with the manosphere, but that means that 80% of men
Yeah,
don't. And I'm really lucky to be surrounded by really supportive allies, so I feel very lucky to have such positive male role models and friends in my life. Um, but I do find it very upsetting, and I worry. I have a team of researchers, and I worry about all of us really and how we can best protect each other. But it is also really important that we're not doing it alone. So we really get a lot of support from each other, and we talk a lot about how can we protect ourselves and what more can we do to look after each other. I think if I
yeah,
was doing it alone, it would be a lot harder.
yeah.
And it's nice,
And
to meet people like you who are, just I've met a lot of people who really are advocating for social change through doing this work, and that's been inspiring, yeah.
And how do you support each other? Is it by talking about it and saying how you feel? Are there other
Yeah,
techniques you've got to support each other?
we do, we talk about it and we share. We have this is a little thing, but suggested by a member of my team that at the end of each meeting, we all share one hopeful thing at the end.
Good. Yeah.
So that's a nice
Yeah.
small thing that we do to help.
And give us, I'm not asking you to share your colleagues' examples, but where is the hope in this? I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. There's people like you doing the research. You've just got a big grant, so people want to find ways of addressing this. But are there any encouraging signs in terms of what we're seeing in this field?
Oh, it's hard, isn't it? I think when I look at the political environment now, it seems like liberal values and equality are really
Yeah.
on the decline. I look what's happening. I'm British American. If I look what's happening in America, it's really hard to find hope in the global picture. Um, but I would say, we're not currently winning the fight against online harm, but there are a lot of people who are trying. And I guess that's where I find hope is how many of us realize that this is a problem. And
Yes.
it seems like there's a public conversation happening about it now that wasn't happening even a couple of years ago. So I find hope in that.
And a question again in the chat. have you interviewed any incels or people that are still very much part of the manosphere and believe strongly in these views? Have you interviewed them and can try and understand their mindset?
No, I haven't yet done that, although we would like to try. Obviously, recruitment is very difficult,
Yeah,
but there are other groups who have done that type of research where they've talked to people who are embedded in these communities and asked what appeals to them about it and what do why do they believe the particular things that they do.
and what does that, can you say anything more about what in their background has led them to being attracted to that?
Yeah, I think the best I mean, I guess I have some hesitation about the extent to which people have insight into why they find particular things appealing.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think part of the answer is interviewing people, but part of it's also looking at people's actual digital traces online and saying, well,
yeah,
like what was the gateway content that they were watching? What were they watching immediately prior to watching this incel content that they might have been drawn into it? I see in the chat that there's a comment about reformed incels, which is a really interesting point. So there are these communities on Reddit that we have been looking into of people who say that they had left the incel community or
yeah,
that they've left the red pill. And I'm absolutely fascinated to read the reasons why. So, for example, some people talk about how they realized that it was inconsistent, the types of things that were being said in that space, or they found a girlfriend, or they got a new job and it helped their self-esteem. So there's a whole variety of ways in which people can be talk about being led away from that type of content as well. So that's something that in the future we're really interested in looking into in more depth.
yeah. I think that's fascinating. And whether people who still hold these views, but if they're in certain jobs or organizations, they will have learned that they can't be saying them explicitly because there'll be a lot of senior women or men that will be very upset if they give these views. So they might feel they've got to hide them, and then they won't want to be interviewed, I suppose.
Yeah,
Um,
that's really difficult, isn't it? How do we distinguish the people who have genuinely changed their mind from the people who have realized
yeah.
they need to hide their views? The problem is
So
prejudice.
another comment in the chat, my own son, who's in his early 20s, has had conversations with his mother about this. He says he feels that everything he sees on TV blames white men for everything. And he grew up feeling a lot of guilt. That's very interesting about what he was seeing on TV. And there was no space for him to say he was proud of who he was. Um, and other people would say, well, you're so privileged, it's fine. But, he's happy. You're grateful to be privileged, but you can't, you shouldn't have to apologize for it.
No, absolutely. And I
What,
think
what,
it's also the case that for some young men, this narrative of privilege just doesn't resonate with them. So, if you come from an economically deprived background or from financial instability, it for sure doesn't feel like being privileged. And to see people on TV who clearly come from a more affluent background talking about the ways in which they've been disadvantaged, I think that must be really hard. Um, and I've had a lot of privilege myself, so I don't exempt myself from that kind of narrative. But I think we do need to find ways to celebrate young men and celebrate all the different ways like positive masculinity, I guess.
and that issue of there's so much blame on white men, he felt guilty from what all he was seeing on TV, which is
Mhm.
interesting. And we've talked about mental health, and I wonder if that is one of the things that's influencing young men's mental health. If they feel, well,
Yeah.
I get I get blamed for everything.
Yeah, I
Um,
think this is a message that we really need strongly to get across is that sexism is bad for everyone. It's bad
yeah,
for there are some situations in which they're inappropriately blamed, and it's also bad for men. There are some situations in which they're inappropriately blamed. There's a mental health crisis among men. There's insufficient paternity leave for men. There's all sorts of norms about what men are and aren't supposed to be like that's hurtful for them, and I think we need to get that message across more strongly that I think the manosphere, they want to present gender relations as a zero-sum game. Either society is benefiting women or it's benefiting men, and that isn't the truth. The truth is that a more equal society would be helpful for everyone. It'll free men from these constraints of the idea that, there's just one proper way to be a man. Um, so I think that's part of a political messaging needs to be that.
Yeah. And can you think of any positive male influencers that we could invite along for one of these talks or one of our live events to just try and give a very different perspective?
Yeah, what a lovely idea. I always feel a bit shy about it because I feel like I'm just sort of this middle-aged, like, uncool academic, and I don't know what, what young people find inspiring, really. Lewis Hamilton, somebody says in the chat, what a great idea. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love Gareth Southgate. I don't know, does he seem like a granddad to teenage boys? I don't know.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of
Well,
fantastic sports stars out there. I see Tom Daley has a new, documentary about his diving career. I think he's a really fantastic role.
yeah. Yeah. We've tried a few. Well, I think we should just contact these people and ask them
Yeah.
if they would help us.
Yeah, invite
Um,
me along if you invite one of them. Thank
yeah.
you, audience.
Someone else saying Danny Dyer was fab in the assembly, very honest about his mental health, and that's a very good point.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's a great organization called Dad's Rock that's been helping young men with overcoming stereotypes and improving their mental health. I don't know that organization, but what a great suggestion. And
Yeah, thank you
they
very
might be very pleased to put somebody up in a panel about discussing that.
Yeah,
Um, and just to say, you look neither middle-aged nor um, a boring academic in any way at all.
you're lovely, thank you.
Oh, and the Dad Rocks is in North Ayrshire, so they would we could contact them.
Sounds
So
brilliant.
we're coming to the end of our time now. Um, is there anything you had hoped to get across, Harriet, that we haven't covered, or additional things that you wanted to add into this conversation?
I don't think so. It's been such an interesting conversation. I really appreciate all of the questions and the opportunity to talk with you all. It's been wonderful.
I shall finish here and just to say thank you, Harriet. I know you said you've now got a large research project that's going to go on for 5 years, which is a long time to wait for you to come back and give us all the results. But it'd be lovely to have you back because as you're learning more and more about this, there'll be new information. And your work with schools, there'll be more information about the impact of that. So it would be lovely to hear more about that. And I'll certainly keep an eye on your publications.
Thank you. It's
So
lovely to be
thank you. And thanks to everybody for joining us.